Good evening. Tonight's story is called The Legend of the Cailleach from ancient Scottish folklore. So, snuggle up under the blankets and prepare for a wonderful night of sleep. And, once you're all settled in, close your eyes. I was 32 when I first heard whispers of her name on a bitter winter night in the Scottish Highlands, where the wind cut through stone and flesh alike. The old shepherd who took me in from the storm spoke of the Cailleach, the blue-faced hag goddess, who shaped the mountains with her hammer and commanded the winter storms with a mere gesture of her ancient hands. His eyes, faded to the pale blue of winter sky, gleamed as he told me how she'd walked these lands since the beginning of time, how she washed her great plaid in the whirlpool of Cailleach, creating tempests that could sink ships, how she turned to stone when spring came, only to awaken with the first frost. I didn't believe in such tales then, but that was before I followed him up the mountain path where the mist parted like a veil between worlds. The storm had caught me unaware on the narrow road between Glencoe and Fort William. My rental car struggled against the wind, wipers barely keeping pace with the sleet that turned suddenly to heavy snow. When the engine sputtered and died on a lonely stretch of road, I cursed my stubborn decision to drive rather than take the bus. March in the Highlands, the locals had warned, was fickle as fortune. I trudged through deepening snow, the weight of my camera equipment a constant reminder of why I'd come to capture the wild beauty of Scotland in its transition from winter to spring. The wind whipped my face raw, and the early darkness of northern latitudes was closing in when I spotted the curl of smoke from a stone cottage tucked against the hillside. The shepherd introduced himself as Alastair, taking my soaked coat without comment and hanging it by a peat fire that glowed orange in a hearth blackened by generations of similar fires. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd lived a life paced to the seasons rather than clocks. American? He asked, pushing a mug of tea into my hands, strong and sweet with a splash of something stronger that burned pleasantly down to my stomach. Kenyan, I corrected, my fingers tingling painfully as they thawed. I was photographing in Glen Edelf when the weather turned. Alastair nodded, as if this explained everything about me. The hills have their own weather, he said, and their own warnings, if you've the ears to hear them. The cottage was simple, but not Spartan. Books lined rough wooden shelves, their spines well worn. A loom occupied one corner with a half-finished weaving of deep blues and grays that echoed the highland landscape. A border collie lay before the fire, opening one eye to assess me before returning to sleep. "You're lucky," Alastair said, stirring a pot that filled the single room with the rich scent of lamb stew. "Another hour, and I wouldn't have heard you over the wind. She's in a temper tonight. She..." His weathered face creased into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The Cailleach, the old woman of winter. When the storm comes down from the north like this, fast and bitter, the old folks would say she's beating her staff against the mountains." I spoke with such certainty that I found myself glancing toward the windows, now rattling beneath the force of the gale. Outside, the world had disappeared into swirling white. "I've heard of her," I said, though my knowledge was superficial at best. "Something about a winter goddess from Celtic mythology. She's some kind of witch." Alastair made a sound between a laugh and a snort. "Not a witch. Older than that. Older than the stones themselves, some say." He ladled stew into two bowls, placing one before me with a chunk of dark bread. "The Cailleach was here when the mountains were born. She carved them with her staff and carried the rocks in her apron. When she dropped them, they became the mountains and glens." I ate hungrily, the warmth of the food as restorative as his words were intriguing. My academic background had focused on comparative mythology, though my career had veered toward landscape photography. There was something in Alastair's tone, not just the lilt of his Highland accent, but a gravity that suggested he wasn't merely repeating folklore. "You speak as if she's real," I ventured. He settled into a chair across from me, the firelight casting deep shadows in the valleys of his face. His eyes, when they met mine, held the pale clarity of winter sky. "There are different kinds of real," he said. "The Cailleach is as real as the storm outside, as real as the mountains that break the clouds, as real as the seasons that turn whether we will it or not." The wind chose that moment to howl down the chimney, sending sparks dancing across the hearthstones. The Callie lifted her head, ears alert. "She's listening," Alastair said, and I couldn't tell if he was referring to the dog or something else entirely. "Now, finish your stew and tell me what brings a Canadian last to the Highlands in the teeth of winter's end," as I explained my photography project, documenting places where ancient myths intersected with the landscape. His expression shifted from polite interest to something more intent. "Then, you've come to the right door," he said when I'd finished, "for there's not a hill or a lock in these parts that doesn't have her fingerprints upon it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping as if sharing a confidence. "And if it's the old stories you're after, I have a tale or two that won't be found in your guidebooks." Outside, the storm raged on, but within those stone walls, I felt the first stirring of something I hadn't expected to find in that remote corner of Scotland, a sense of having arrived exactly where I was meant to be. The mountains weren't always here, you know, Alastair said, stoking the fire as the wind moaned through the eaves. "When the world was young, Scotland was flat as a bannock cake." I smiled at this, cradling my second mug of tea, now laced with honey instead of whiskey. The storm showed no signs of abating, and I'd accepted that I would be spending the night. Alastair had already made up a pallet for me near the fire, insisting I'd take his bed while he slept in the chair. "Cailleach changed all that," he continued. "She came from the north, some say from the very ice that covered the land ages past, blue-faced and white-haired, with teeth of rock and eyes that held winter's heart." His hands, gnarled as oak roots, shaped the air as if molding the figure he described. She carried stones in her apron as she strode across the land. Where they fell, mountains rose. Through this small window, I could just make out the hulking shadow of a mountain against the night sky when the clouds momentarily parted. Ben Nevis, perhaps, or one of its neighbors. "That one there," Alastair nodded toward the window. "The locals call it the Sleeping Warrior for its shape against the sky, but the older name means the Cailleach's chair, where she'd sit to survey her handiwork. And she created all the mountains this way," I asked, finding myself drawn into his narrative, despite the rational part of my mind that catalogued this as merely colorful local folklore. "Not all at once," he replied. "She's been at it for ages. The Cailleach is time itself. You see, she was old when the first people came to these shores." He gestured to a small shelf where a collection of stones set ordinary river rocks to my eye, but arranged with obvious care. "Some say she exists in the rocks themselves, that when spring comes and her power wanes, she turns to stone until winter returns again." I thought of the countless standing stones and megalithic structures that dotted Scotland's landscape, ancient monuments whose purposes were still debated by archaeologists. "Is that why there are so many stone circles here?" Alastair's eyes crinkled. "Perhaps, though those were human hands that raised them, not hers. But humans have always known her power and sought to harness it, or honor it." He reached for one particular stone, smooth and gray, with a vein of quartz running through it like a silver thread. This one I found on the shores of Loch Ah. They say the loch formed when the Cailleach fell asleep while guarding a well on Ben Cruachan. The waters flooded the valley below. Placed the stone in my palm. It was heavier than it looked, and cool despite its proximity to the fire. You speak as if you've seen her, I said, only half-dashed joking. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze directed inward to some private memory. I've spent 68 winters in these hills, he finally said. I've seen her work, if not her face. Something in his tone made me hesitate before asking my next question. What does that mean? When I was a young man, no older than you, I was caught in a blizzard on the northern face of Ben Nevis. Should have died. There many have in less fierce weather. But the storm, changed. I found myself in a place of perfect stillness, the eye of the tempest. The snow was falling all around, but not on the path before me. His fingers absently stroked the collie's head. That path led me to a crevice in the rock, just large enough for a man to shelter in. I survived the night there, while two other climbers weren't so fortunate. The dog whined softly, as if responding to something in his voice. Was it luck? I asked. I didn't think so then. I felt he searched for the word. Chosen, somehow, or tested. His weathered face was solemn in the firelight. The Cailleach doesn't give her gifts freely. She's not a gentle goddess. The word goddess hung in the air between us. Not a myth or a folktale character, but a deity of presence to be reckoned with. Tomorrow, if the storm passes, I'll show you, Alastair said. There's a place up the glen where you can feel her presence most strongly. The locals still leave offerings there, even those who go to church on Sundays. He smiled faintly. Old ways die hard in the highlands. I turned the stone over in my hand, watching how the firelight caught and refracted in its quartz vein. Outside, the wind had shifted, no longer howling, but singing a lower, steadier note, like a distant voice calling across the mountains. I'd like that, I said, and was surprised to realize how much I meant it. Alistair nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. Rest now. The Cailleach's country is best seen in the first light of dawn. Morning arrived with the hushed quality that follows heavy snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, every harsh edge smoothed, every familiar shape made strange and new. We set out just after dawn, Alastair leading the way with his staff and the Callie, Bess, bounding ahead through snow that reached her chest in places I had expected to drive. But Alastair shook his head when I mentioned my car. The roads won't be cleared until afternoon. Where we're going, there are no roads anyway. He handed me a walking stick of polished blackthorn. Besides, the glen reveals itself differently to those who approach on foot. The cold air stung my lungs, but the exertion of trudging through snow soon had warmth spreading through my limbs. We followed what might have been a stream in warmer months, now a smooth white channel winding between slopes. The rising sun caught the peaks above us, setting them ablaze with rose gold light while we walked in blue shadow. The Cailleach was here long before the Christians, Alastair said, his breath forming clouds that dissipated in the still air. Before the Romans, before the Picts. Some say she came with the ice itself when glaciers carved these valleys. Is she unique to Scotland? I asked, my mind cataloging similarities to winter deities in other cultures' old man winter. The Russian Morocco, the Norse frost giants. She has cousins in Ireland, and perhaps more distant kin in other lands, Alastair replied. But here, in these mountains, she's most at home. The highlands shaped her as much as she shaped them. He paused, leaning on his staff as he gazed up at the mountains surrounding us. My grandmother used to say that when the Cailleach breathes, we call it the north wind. When she weeps, we call it rain. When she sings, we call it thunder. We walked in silence for a time. The only sounds are boots creaking in the snow and Bess's occasional bark as she flushed a hare or grouse from cover. Around a bend in the valley, Alasdair pointed to a massive boulder split down the middle, creating a passage just wide enough for a person to walk through. The Cailleach's gate, he said. In the old days, people would leave offerings here before entering the glen. A bit of bread, a dram of whiskey, a bright pebble, anything to show respect, and if they didn't, his smile was cryptic. Then they might find the weather turning against them or lose their way even on a clear day. The Cailleach doesn't suffer disrespect lightly. I fingered my camera, suddenly unsure whether it would be appropriate to photograph this place. Alasdair seemed to sense my hesitation. She doesn't mind being remembered, he said, only being forgotten. With that reassurance, I captured the split stone, framing the valley beyond, the light catching crystalline frost along its edges. As we passed through the narrow gap, I felt a subtle shift, not in temperature or light, but something less tangible, a presence, or perhaps merely the power of suggestion. After Alasdair's stories, the glen opened before us, a hidden valley cradled between steep slopes. At its center stood a cluster of ancient rowan trees, their red berries bright against the snow. Beside them, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rocks at first glance, was a low stone structure. Tai Nam Bodach, Alasdair said, the house of the old ones. As we drew closer, I saw it was a crude shelter, partially collapsed and rebuilt many times over what must have been centuries. It resembled the bothan, the simple huts Scottish shepherds once used as summer dwellings in the high pastures, but smaller, as if built for children, or something other than humans. What is it? I asked, my voice instinctively dropping to a whisper. A shrine, Alasdair replied, matching my hushed tone. One of the oldest continuously used sacred sites in Britain. He knelt with some difficulty in the snow and brushed aside a flat stone that served as a door. Within the dark interior, I could make out several stone figures, worn smooth by countless hands in the passage of time. Alasdair reached in and carefully lifted one out. It was roughly human-shaped, with natural contours suggesting a hunched figure wrapped in a cloak. Without artistic embellishment, it nevertheless conveyed a powerful impression of age and femininity. It's Cailleach, Alasdair said, holding it with reverence. And these, he indicated the other stones still in the shelter, are the Bodach, her consort, and their children. I stared at the simple stone, trying to reconcile its humble appearance with the cosmic creator he described, the shaper of mountains, the bringer of storms. Every spring at Bedtime, the 1st of May, these stones are brought out and placed to watch over the glen, Alasdair explained. And every autumn at Samhain, the last day of October, they return to shelter for the winter. It's been done this way for longer than anyone can remember. Who does it now? I asked. Those who remember the old ways, he said simply, myself included. He carefully replaced the Cailleach stone and stood, brushing snow from his knees. There was a time when every glen had its shrine, every loch its offering place. Now this is one of the few that remains. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a spiral of snow dancing around us like a miniature cyclone. It circled the stone house 3 times before dissipating. Alasdair watched it with an inscrutable expression. She's aware of us, he said quietly. Come, let's sit in the shelter of the rowans. There's more I should tell you before the day grows older. We sheltered beneath the rowan trees, their twisted branches forming a natural canopy. Alasdair produced a small flask from inside his coat and offered it to me. The whiskey burned pleasantly, a liquid fire against the mountain cold. The ritual with the stones, I began. It mirrors the changing seasons. Alasdair nodded, his breath visible in the crystalline air. The Cailleach rules the dark half of the year, from Samhain to Beltane winter into spring. When the stones come out, her reign ends and brides begins. Bride, Bryed, some call her, the maiden of summer. Flame to the Cailleach's frost, eyes crinkled at the corners. They're two faces of the same coin. Some say the Cailleach in her youth was bride, and bride in her age will become the Cailleach again. An endless cycle, like the seasons themselves. I thought of the stone figure, weathered and formless, yet somehow conveying ancient power. And the ritual ensures the seasons change properly, so the old ones believed. He tapped his walking stick against the frozen ground. There's a story. Long ago, when people first came to this glen, they found it harsh and unwelcoming. Winter lasted too long. The summers were too short for crops to ripen. They were preparing to abandon the place when an old woman appeared during the worst blizzard in memory. Seeking shelter, Has had settled at his feet, her eyes closing as he spoke, as if she'd heard this tale many times before. Most turned her away, fearing there wasn't enough food to share. But one family welcomed her, giving her the warmest place by their fire, sharing their meager stores. In the morning, the old woman was gone, but the storm had passed. The family found a bundle of strange stones by their door, with instructions to place them outside in spring and return them to shelter in autumn. The Cailleach stones, I murmured. Indeed, that year and every year after, the seasons turned properly. The snows melted at the right time. The rains came when needed. The harvest was bountiful. He took another sip from the flask. But one year, the ritual was forgotten. The stones remained outside through winter, exposed to wind and frost. What happened? The worst winter in living memory. Wolves came down from the mountains, desperate with hunger. Livestock died in the fields. Children sickened. The streams froze solid. His voice had taken on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. Finally, an old shepherd remembered the stones. The entire glen gathered to bring them into shelter, apologizing for their neglect. That very night, the thaw began. I glanced back at the stone house, wondering how many generations had participated in the ritual. How many hands had touched those weathered figures? You think it's more than coincidence? I think, he said carefully, that there are currents in the world we've forgotten how to navigate. The old ones knew the land provides, if we remember our obligations to it. A sudden gust of wind shook snow from the branches above us, dusting our shoulders with fine powder. The Cailleach isn't just winter, Alasdair continued. She's transformation. Without her, there would be no renewal. Nothing would die, nothing would be reborn. He leaned forward. That's what people forget about winter. It's not just an Indinix preparation. Under the snow, seeds wait. Inside their burrows, animals dream. The darkness is necessary for the light to mean something. There was a passion in his voice that went beyond folklore, something personal and deeply felt. You've come to photograph the places where myths touch the land, he said, echoing my words from the night before. But have you considered that the land itself might be the original myth? That mountains and glens, rivers and lochs might have consciousness of their own? The question caught me off guard. My academic background made me want to categorize his words as animism or pantheism, to intellectualize them. But sitting there in that hidden valley, surrounded by mountains, older than human memory. Such distinctions seemed suddenly artificial. I don't know, I answered honestly. Neither do I, he said, surprising me. Not with certainty, but I've spent my life in these hills, and I've felt something. Moments when the boundary between myself and the mountain seemed to dissolve. Times when the wind carried words in no human language. His weathered face was solemn. Call it the Cailleach, call it the spirit of the land names, or just our way of grasping what might be beyond grasping. The light was changing, shadows lengthening across the snow as clouds gathered over the mountain peaks. There was a heaviness to the air, a metallic temps that promised more snow. We should start back, Alastair said, rising stiffly. The weather's turning. I looked up at the darkening sky, then back at the stone house with its ancient occupants. As I did, a single snowflake drifted down, landing on my outstretched hand where it melted instantly. She's not finished with winter yet, Alastair murmured. We'd gone less than half a mile when the snowfall began in earnest, not the gentle dusting that had greeted the day's beginning, but heavy flakes that swirled and danced on gusting winds. Within minutes, our tracks from the morning were obliterated, and the landmarks I'd carefully noted had vanished into a world of white. We need shelter, Alastair called, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. There's a bothy further up in Old Hunter's hut. We can wait out the worst of it there. I followed in his footsteps, head bent against the stinging snow. Bess pressed close to my legs, as if guiding me. The sudden change in weather seemed to confirm everything Alastair had told me about the Cailleach's capricious nature. One moment, clear skies and breathtaking beauty. The next, danger. The Beathy materialized like a ghostly low stone structure with a partially collapsed roof, now laden with snow. Inside, it was cold but dry, the dirt floor packed hard by years of use. A rudimentary hearth stood against one wall, and Alastair immediately set about gathering what remained of the firewood stacked beside it. Will your family worry about you? I asked, suddenly aware that he might have responsibilities beyond entertaining a stranded photographer with old legends. No family left to worry, he replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than melancholy. My wife passed 7 winters ago. Our daughter lives in Australia with her husband and children, too far to worry about an old man's daily comings and goings. The fire caught, small at first, then growing as Alastair fed it carefully. Bess curled beside it, steam rising from her damp fur. Outside, the wind's howl had taken on an almost vocal quality, rising and falling like wordless singing. I spent a night like this once, Alastair said, settling beside me on a rough bench against the wall. Nearly 30 years ago now. I was younger, more foolish. Thought I knew these mountains better than they knew themselves. His eyes reflected the dancing flames. I was wrong, Kay. Waited, sensing he needed to tell this story as much as I needed to hear it. It was late October Samhain approaching. I'd been high up, checking on sheep that had yet to come down for winter. The storm came from nowhere, just like this one. He gestured toward the door, where snow was beginning to drift in through the cracks. I lost the path, lost all sense of direction. The cold was like a living thing, searching for ways into my clothes, my skin, my bones. The fire popped and hissed as melting snow dripped from the roof. I stumbled into a place I didn't recognize, a high quarry that seemed to catch and hold the storm like a bowl. The snow was so thick I couldn't see my hand before my face. My strength was failing. His voice had dropped to a near whisper. That's when I saw her. Logs settled in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. At first, I thought it was just another boulder, There were many in that place, but this one moved, stood upright. In the whirling snow, I made out a figure, tall as two men, wrapped in white. Her face, he faltered. I can't properly describe her face. Old as the mountains, young as the first frost, both at once. Somehow, her eyes held the winter stars. I found myself leaning forward, drawn by the quiet intensity of his words. She spoke no words I could understand, but I felt her question in my mind. What was I doing in her domain? Unprepared, unwise. What right did I have to challenge her mountains, her weather? He shook his head slowly. I had no answer but the truth. I told her I had been arrogant, thinking myself master of the hills when I was merely a guest. I asked not for rescue, but for forgiveness, and sighed. The wind's voice rose to a keening wail, then fell to silence, so sudden it seemed deafening. When I awoke, Eliza continued. I was lying in the shelter of a rock outcropping with no memory of how I'd reached it. My clothes were crusted with ice, but beneath them, I was warm. Beside me lay a walking staff I had never seen before, the same one I carried to this day. He touched the blackthorn stick that leaned against the wall. The storm was gone. The sky was clear as crystal, and I knew exactly where I was and how to get home. I glanced at the staff, noticing for the first time the intricate patterns in its grain, like frozen rivers or frost on a window pane. "Do you believe she saved you?" I asked. "I believe she tested me," he replied, "and I must have passed, or I wouldn't be sitting here telling you the tale." He stirred the fire with a branch. "The Cailleach doesn't grant favors freely. She demands acknowledgement of her power and of our place in her realm." The wind had begun to rise again, moaning around the corners of the bothy like a living creature seeking entry. "Listen," Alastair said softly. "She's singing the old song, the one about endings and beginnings, death and rebirth." His eyes met mine across the flickering light, the one about transformation. As if in response, the fire flared suddenly brighter, illuminating the small space with golden light. Outside, the storm continued, enveloping us in a world reduced to stone, flame, and the howling voice of winter. I must have slept, lulled by the warmth of the fire and Alastair's voice, for when I opened my eyes, the quality of light had changed. The storm's fury had spent itself, and silence reigned, that profound cotton-wrapped silence that follows heavy snow. A pale, pearly light filtered through the bothy's single small window. "Dawn," Alastair said, already awake and tending to a small kettle suspended over the rekindled fire. "The Cailleach has moved on." We shared a simple breakfast of oatcakes and tea brewed from herbs Alastair produced from his pocket. Heather and thyme with a hint of something sharper I couldn't identify. The warmth spread through me like liquid sunlight. When we stepped outside, I gasped involuntarily. The world had been remade in our absence. Every surface was coated with snow that glittered like diamond dust in the first rays of morning sun. The air was so clear, it seemed to magnify distance rather than diminish it, bringing far mountains startlingly close. But most remarkable was the light itself. Not the golden glow of a typical sunrise, but a silvery radiance that lent the landscape an otherworldly quality, as if we had stepped into some realm between waking and dreaming. "Sid, she left her mark," Alastair said, gesturing to a perfect circle of undisturbed snow surrounding the bothy. Beyond it, the snow was rippled and drifted by the storm's passing, but within that boundary, not a flake appeared out of place. Vis approached the circle's edge cautiously, sniffing the air before crossing it. I followed, half expecting to feel some resistance, some acknowledgement of a threshold crossed. There was nothing tangible, and yet a subtle shift in the air, perhaps, or merely in my perception of it. The Cailleach doesn't just bring winter, Alastor said, his voice hushed in the morning stillness. She brings clarity. In summer, the land is clothed in green, everything hidden, disguised. In winter, she strips away the excess, reveals the bones of the earth. He gestured toward the mountains, their contours sharp and defined beneath their white mantle. She shows us what endures. We began our journey back toward his cottage, following a route different from the one we'd taken the day before. The snow was deep, but firm enough to walk upon, especially where the wind had packed it tight. The sun rose higher, turning the world blindingly bright, so that I had to shield my eyes. "Look there," Alastor said suddenly, pointing to a ridge above us. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a movement caught my eye. Many deer, picking their way delicately across the snowfield. Their breath hung in the frigid air like small clouds. "Red deer," Alastor murmured. "The Cailleach's own. She herds them across the mountaintops, and where they tread, the snow melts to reveal new growth beneath." As if to illustrate his words, the herd moved in perfect unison across the ridge, their russet coats vivid against the snow. Leading them was a majestic stag, his antlers spreading like a crown of thorns against the sky. The old folk would say, "That's her consort," the Bodach Alastor said, taking animal form to walk among us. I raised my camera instinctively, then hesitated, looking to Alastor for permission. He nodded. Through the viewfinder, I saw the stag pause at the crest of the ridge. For a moment, though, I knew it was impossible at that distance. I could have sworn he looked directly at us. Pia, his gaze ancient and knowing. Then he tossed his great head and bounded away, the herd flowing after him like water over stone. "A gift," Alastor said softly, "an acknowledgement of what? That we passed her test, that we remembered our place in her realm." He smiled, the sun catching the snow white of his beard, or perhaps simply that we stopped to see when so many hurried past without looking. We continued our descent, the land gradually becoming more familiar as we approached terrain I recognized from our outward journey. Yet it seemed to change somehow, just by the snow, but by the stories Alastor had shared, by the night and the storm, by the deer on the ridge. When the Cailleach walked the hills in human form, Alastor said, breaking a long, comfortable silence, she would appear as an old woman gathering firewood. Those who treated her with kindness, offering shelter or food or simple courtesy, found their winters mild and their summers fruitful. Those who turned her away faced her wrath in blizzard and flood. A lesson in hospitality, I observed. A lesson in recognition, he corrected gently, in seeing the divine in the ordinary, the extraordinary in the everyday. As we rounded a bend in the path, his cottage came into view. Smoke rising straight as a plumb line from its chimney into the still air. Beside it, half buried in snow, my rental car waited like a patient animal. "The roads will be cleared by now," Alastor said. "You'll be able to continue your journey." I nodded, surprised by the reluctance I felt at the prospect. In just a day and night, this place and this man with his quiet wisdom had worked their way under my skin in a manner I hadn't anticipated. We shared one last meal before I departed. Fresh bread Alastor had baked that morning, cheese, and the remains of the previous night's stew. The cottage felt different in daylight, smaller, yet somehow more expansive, as if the boundaries between inside and outside had grown permeable. "Will you continue your project?" Alastor asked as I packed my camera equipment. photographing places where myths touched the land. Yes, I said, though I think differently about it now. I paused, trying to articulate the shift. Before, I saw myths as stories humans created to explain natural phenomena. Now, I wonder if it isn't the other way around, if the land itself generates the stories, speaking through us. Okay, he nodded, pleased. The Cailleach would approve of that perspective. Outside, the sun had begun its early winter descent, casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. I hesitated by my car, reluctant to leave without some tangible connection to what I'd experienced. I have something for you, Alastair said, as if reading my thoughts. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into my palm. It was a stone, smooth and round, small enough to enclose completely in my fist. Unlike the river rocks he'd shown me earlier, this one was white, not the dull white of quartz, but a translucent alabaster that seemed to hold the very quality of winter light within it. I found it years ago, high on Ben Cruachan, he said, near where the Cailleach is said to have dozed while guarding her well. I turned it over, feeling its perfect weight, its coolness against my skin. I can't take this. You can, and you will, he interrupted gently. It wasn't mine to keep forever. It's a traveler, that stone. It has places to go, people to meet. His eyes twinkled. Consider yourself its temporary guardian. I closed my fingers around it, feeling an inexplicable certainty that he was right, that the stone had somehow chosen to travel with me, at least for a time. Thank you, I said, knowing the words were inadequate for everything: his hospitality, his stories, this glimpse into a world where mountains breathed and winter had a face. For everything. Remember, he said, the Cailleach isn't just a story from the past. She's here now, in every winter storm, every mountain shadow, every transformation. She doesn't need belief to exist, only recognition. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as Alastair and Bess grew smaller, then vanished around a bend in the road. The sun caught the snow-covered peaks, turning them to fire. That was 5 years ago. I completed my photography project.